One of the great things about public art in this day and age of instant internet delivery is that the things of faith, the right understandings of which is said to be the preserve of a particular group of religious controllers, are splashed loud over our screens, causing consternation, controversy, and for me, applause. For get it right or get it wrong, let's look, think, discuss, and maybe look again. Although you probably know which piece of religious public art I'm alluding to, and the clamour it has generated since the opening of the Olympics in Paris, let's start with Leonardo's painting, which in its day was both creative and controversial, and big, 4.5 meters by 8.8 meters, very big. Da Vinci's Last Supper was completed in 1498 and can be seen today in Milan. He paints the moment right after Jesus allegedly declares to his 12 apostles that one of them will betray him. And of course, he was following the church understanding at the time that there were only 12 apostles and that they were only men. And like most people then and since, he was following the understanding that such a Last Supper actually happened, and happened as the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, suggest. Whereas we now know that these Gospels, their writers and editors, using texts from the Hebrew Scriptures, created a passion tableau, a prelude to his death, that was liturgically reenacted prior to Easter each year. So to be clear, the Last Supper is not history. It is Christology, understandings of the post-Easter Jesus woven into liturgy, which became gospel pseudo-history. But what does have more of a historical leg or legs is that Jesus seemed to make a habit of dining out with others, with religious conservatives, with rich people, with people who didn't like him, and also with publicans, prostitutes, and sinners. Who exactly fell into those three categories is unclear. But we do know that tax collectors, thugs in the employ of Rome were one, and women who transgressed against the rules of patriarchal society and got labelled as sinners were another, and people who were sick, for surely you must have done something wrong in order to be sick, were another. Generally speaking, these publicans, prostitutes, and sinners were people who didn't fit with the powerful religious thought police and behavior control monitors of that society. Sometimes in the gospel stories, the religious, the rich, and the misfits were all at the same table, or at least in the same room. And sometimes, oftentimes maybe, Jesus was preaching a message about not judging, making room for difference, and sharing. Not dissimilar to what Thomas Folly, the artistic director of the Paris spectacle, had in mind. Tolerance and sharing were the message of the post-Easter movement. As members and new gathered each week, misfits in the empire, to support each other, remember the teachings Jesus had passed down, and share food. From these gatherings would emerge in time the rite of communion and the writings of the New Testament. and centuries later art, like Da Vinci's. Leonardo would break with convention. His brush created a sense of movement and emotion, and the individualistic reactions in the apostles' faces. He painted his friends in, maybe even himself. He made it personal, theological even. For isn't the liturgy of the Passion saying that we all betrayed him? All of us fell and fall short of the ideals of inclusion and radical redistribution of resources. And yet we still belong, and there's still a place for us at the table. It was this passion to challenge who belonged and who controlled what and where God is that inspired James K. Baxter to write The Mighty Jesus. The whole poem is a sermon in itself. I merely want to point to his apostles, detailed in the second stanza of that poem, as those Leonardo Baxter would have painted around the table. A man who cleaned the toilets at the railway station, a prostitute who didn't charge, a housewife who worried that she might be pregnant and horror of horrors threw her TV in the bin, a sad old queen, is there a pun intended here? And an alcoholic minister going slowly mad in a respectable parish. All people who Mr. Trump and many others would call losers, including in the loser category, of course, Jesus himself, being Māori, being poor, poorly dressed, and totally lacking in the ambition and worldview of the successful, which is the point of the poem. It's an image of Jesus and disciples, an offensive image in 1970s New Zealand when and where it was written. Jesus a loser with his loser disciples. A poem preaching a message of not judging, making room for difference and sharing. Apologists for Thomas Folly, Paris's artistic director, point out that contrary to the Christian assumption that anything that remotely looks like anything like us must be about us, is not so. The Folly tableau at the opening ceremony, wishing to allude to the Olympics' Greek origins, was about Dionysius, the blue figure, god of fertility, festivals, ritual madness and pleasure, and about a Greek bacchanal, a lavish, noisy feasting affair that lasted several days and was held in ancient Greece to celebrate events like the Olympics. The impolite apologists declared, Christians, it's not all about you. The world doesn't revolve around Christianity. Not everyone aims to offend Christians, you know. And the polite apologist said, sorry you were upset because you were upset, which is very different from saying sorry and we wish we hadn't done it. Because clearly most of the audience, including most Parisians and Olympic goers, were not sorry they had done it and seemed to love it. They loved the spectacle, the singers, the drama, the overt celebration of queer, and even the controversy following. The only thing they didn't love was the rain. Yet when you create such a piece of art, part of your brilliance is knowing what you are doing, who you are commending, and who you are offending. When you unapologetically ask drag queens and gender-diverse people to dress up, act up, exaggerate, take a lead, you know you're not just affirming them, and all who similarly identify. But you are challenging the people and cultures that disapprove and denigrate gender diversity and the celebration of the same, of which there are plenty in Europe, plenty around the world, and plenty within the Christian church. Orson Welles is an artist who put together what's called a Last Supper creation. She got angry when some Christians said AIDS was God's punishment. So she created her drag queen Last Supper for a gay pride art exhibit. It is both an affirmation of queer inclusion and a protest against Christians who have a punishing God. So, I can, on the one hand, agree that Folly's Paris display wasn't literally about Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper. While on the other hand, I do think it's about who is at and can be at God's table. God's table being a metaphor for who is included, part of, and belongs. Which I also think was Da Vinci's point back in the day. To my mind, Folly's tableau was all those Jesus values I mentioned earlier of not judging, making room for difference, celebrating and sharing. Let's remember too, as the American Civil Liberties Union reminds us, there are currently 527 anti-queer bills in the USA, most of which are direct attacks upon transgender youth. And that's just the USA. Think Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Malawi, Oman, and on and on. The very existence of these American bills, whether they pass or not, impacts mental, spiritual, and physical well-being of queer identifying folk everywhere. A number of those bills specifically target drag performers. Instead of affirming making room for difference and all belonging, these bills, to quote the blogger Cassidy Hall, perpetuate a false notion that belonging must be fought for, that belonging is not a birthright, that belonging isn't entwined with a divine image already upon us. Having queer people center stage on one of the biggest stages in the world digital theatre is not a politically neutral act. Being able to have that act understood as referring to Jesus and the 12 apostles is not a politically neutral act. Doing this in France with the ascendancy of the far right and its alliance with conservative Christianity is not a politically neutral act. It's about taking sides, the side of not judging, making room and sharing, the side Jesus was on, the side that got him killed. Jim Palmer, a former mega-church pastor, gives 5 reasons Jesus would have applauded the show on the Olympics opening night. Firstly, Jesus gets it. Given the trauma and abuse of the queer community and its suffering at the hands of religion, it's not surprising that the revolutionary Jesus, who took up the cause of the marginalized and oppressed in his day, would applaud. Secondly, Jesus was one of us. He lived the radical solidarity that no person is separate or separated from God. If Jesus was the artistic director and wanted to allude to the Last Supper, drag queens and other gender diverse people would have been present. Thirdly, Jesus was no saint. He offended religious hierarchies and traditions. He hung out with notorious sinners, validating them. All of which is to say you could make the case that Jesus would fit in well with the drag queen crowd and would not have gone off the rails because a few of them had a little fun doing a drag remix of the Last Supper. Fourthly, there is that little pesky, irritating verse in Matthew 7, verse 3 and following, about a speck and a log in the eyes. Just for a minute, think about what the church has excused or justified over the centuries. Did Folly's tableau burn anyone? Torture anyone? Enslave anyone? Victimize anyone? Rape anyone? Abuse anyone? Lastly, come on, Christians. Let's find something real to be upset about. Like Christian groups and governments, like America, supporting the Israeli government's genocide in Gaza. Like the abuse and neglect of children, young people and adults in the care of state and faith-based institutions in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Like what our coalition government is dialing back on. Climate change. Read our grandchildren's future. Public health. Read children's well-being. Māori health. Read the most vulnerable, medically vulnerable demographic in the country. Come on, Christians, reality check time. If we want to get offended, let's get offended by something really offensive. Blessings to you this week.